If the invasion of a neighboring country by a major neighboring country doesn't push Europeans to spend more in defense and to think about how to do that more smartly, then what will?
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm Adam Dixon. Today I'm joined by Francesca Ghiretti, a research leader at the think tank RAND Europe. She is an expert on China's foreign policy and Europe-China relations, which is also the topic of her new book, Chinese Investments and the Economic Security Turn in Europe. She's also the host of the fantastic podcast, Geoeconomic Competition, which I recommend you all listen to. Francesca, welcome to the New Enlightenment.
Thank you, Adam. From podcaster to podcaster, thank you for having me here.
I like you say I'm a podcaster. I mean, you're a podcaster, but it's like we still have day jobs, right? You know, it's,
Yes.
We were chatting before recording that the nice thing about doing a podcast is just having interesting conversations with people. And, you know, my view is that we should have, you know, there's so many podcasts out there, but I don't think that should deter us from producing them, because it's great to chat with people. It's great to, even if it's one person that finds the podcast interesting, I think it's worth it.
Agreed.
So we're going to talk, instead of about the podcast industry, we're going to talk about China, America, and where Europe and the UK fits in this growing China-US rivalry. Tensions are escalating, we'd say. Curious to know what your thoughts on how much escalation is there, how much is overblown, how much is hyperbole, and then in turn, how those tensions between the United States and China are impacting the strategic decisions of the EU and EU member states, say Europe and UK and their foreign policies.
So I'll try not to say so too many times. It sort of comes from my Italian allora. But in any case, exactly. I think there's a lot of escalation, but that is attributed to the fact that soon, on the 20th of January, Trump is going to be the new president of the United States of America. While, in my opinion, a lot of the escalations that we've seen are just, you know, on this trajectory that we've seen developing, arguably since the first Trump presidency, right? So it's not necessarily a new thing. It's just that we've been in this escalatory trajectory for the past years, and there have been acceleration that are not necessarily immediately related to the US or the US presidency. You had the pandemic, which was a major acceleration. And then you had Russia's invasion of Ukraine for Europe. That was also one of those variables that was extremely fundamental and important in shaping the debate around the relationship with the US and China as well. So not everything, and maybe I'm overcompensating, but these days I'm trying to say not everything that happens in Europe or in China, for that matter, is about Donald Trump. Right. So this is sort of my first point. In terms of impacts for the European Union and for the UK, maybe we can say, for easiness, for Europe, the UK is an island, but it's still part of sort of the concept of Europe. I see three major impacts. One is sort of the easiest one to see, which is the direct impact of regulatory and policy decisions that happen in the US and in China. The two easiest examples perhaps are the export controls adopted by the US on October 2022 and the subsequent policy that developed since, and the need for, first of all, the Netherlands and then other European countries and the European Union as a whole to rethink export controls as an economic security tool. And in terms of China, there are a million of examples, but I asked that I would think about the Belt and Road Initiative and investments related to that framework, and the idea that, well, maybe we need a better framework for our relationship with third countries, especially developing economies. And so the EU came up with a global gateway Now, we could have a very long conversations about whether global gateway has been an efficient type of response, the right response, or anything. But this is more or less a couple of examples of how these policies and decisions impact directly Europe in general. The second has more to do about broader trends in terms of self-sufficiency and protection. Both you see both in the US and in China that there is a growing drive towards self-sufficiency. Now, the timelines are different. China has been working on self-sufficiency for a very long time, arguably, definitely since Xi Jinping came into office, if so we can say, but arguably even before that. So that is a different timeline from the one that, for example, we see in the United States, where the debate about making the internal market stronger is a little bit more recent. And measures like the Inflation Reduction Act really spoke to that need, right, of we need to come first and then the others can negotiate or need to adjust. And we probably see more of that. And that, of course, has been a bit of a reckoning in the European Union and the European landscape of, what happens if the US too begins to boost its own production, internal production, and its own internal companies? What does that mean for us, our companies, and the relocation of our companies? So these are two of the elements. And the last one, then we can, unpack them or everything, but I'll just mention this for now. And the last one is bit of our own reckoning of the European Union, of, again, pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, questions about identity, where we're going, what are our objectives, what does it mean to be a safe and secure European Union, what does it mean to be a commodity importer, what does it mean to be dependent on imports from, certain actors, but globally in general, are supplies resilient enough? Is there something that we should be producing internally that we don't produce anymore? So a bit of reckoning around the overall over, or even not over, but dependencies that the EU had on external actors. So this idea of resilience and how you increase resilience. And so this is sort of the three elements in which I see the tensions between China and the United States impacting. I've spoken a lot about the European Union, but a lot of what I've said applies to the UK as well, right? So this is sort of the overall overview.
The UK, which until it's going on a long time now, actually, right? We're coming on 10 years, but was part of the European Union, and of course, the continent is not very far away. You touched on quite a few interesting points, and I think one is that when you say this self-sufficiency, both on the Chinese case and the American case, because I think there's often a lack of appreciation in both of those cases, the Chinese and the United States, is that, let's start with the United States, is that the United States has always been a very large continental economy, and it's not an open economy like the Netherlands or Ireland or many of these European states, right? The U.S. has always had a degree of self-sufficiency. It's energy self-sufficient. So for the U.S., it's normal to be in that place where it's producing many of its own goods that it's consuming, just because it's a very, very large internal market. And the point saying is that the U.S. it's not reverting to something that, or if you feel like the reversion to something that's a bit more closed, is not out of the ordinary from U.S. economic history. And the same for China. If we think of China in the broader 5,000-year civilizational history, it was very much and always been a very closed, self-sufficient, if you like, economy. And so I think that those underlying long-term historical trends, they're just bubbling up again. In our lifetimes, this is new, but it's almost a reversion to something that was before. Whereas in the European case, there wasn't always that level of self-sufficiency, at least in the contemporary period. So it's still, I mean, you said, what does it mean to be Europe? What does it mean to be this identity? I mean, Europe was always kind of going out, colonialism, imperialism, And that's not to say that there's not American or Chinese imperialism happening, but it's different. I think that's perhaps one of these, I think, factors that, and again, I put the UK in this, right? So when you say UK, Europe, it's all together. And that's where that sense of the world is changing. And we've never been this cohesive internal market that is self-sufficient. And the UK is left.
Yeah, I mean, the same applies to the EU or the UK in this regard, in the sense of, to a certain extent, although not entirely, China and the US may have the luxury of thinking about self-sufficiency. Yeah. Now, total self-sufficiency is highly unlikely in any case, but when you have such large territories, so many people, you can start thinking about self-sufficiency with a bit of a caveat for China, energy-wise. For now, of course, they cannot be self-sufficient, which is a major worry for the Chinese government, right? So this is sort of, I think is an important caveat. But that said, they can have a bit more of an aspiration of trying to go alone in a number of areas if they want to. When it comes to Europe, it's a different story. When it comes to Europe and the majority of the rest of the world, by the way, similar, conversations could happen when we think about other partners in the Indo-Pacific, for example, or in other areas of the world. But when it comes to Europe, you cannot advocate for self-sufficiency because that is going to be extremely damaging to your own economy. Again, you're a commodity importer, so to begin with, you have a major issue. And even in terms of manufacturing, there's so much territory that you have that you can use, and you've already quite developed it in the past and used it in the past. There's a great book that is called The Great Divergence, I think. Yes. Where there is one of the many arguments made in the book to explain why Europe was so economically successful back in the 19th century especially, is because they were able to expand their territories outside their own borders, right? Why England, that has such a so little land to begin with, was able to be successful. Now, this is unpopular, but this is the argument in the book, is, well, colonialism largely helped it to be economically successful. So I want to clarify, I'm not advocating for colonialism today. Okay. I'm just saying, no, I want it to be very clear. Yes. I'm just saying Europe has clear limits, even just in land disposal, at its disposal, right? And raw materials and etc. and so on and so forth. So when it comes to resilience, when it comes to economic security, when it comes to growth, Europe's best option is thinking about diversification and thinking about where you prioritize, which are the areas of priorities for developments inside your borders, and which are the areas that should be developed in the relationship with third countries. Which is why, and maybe we can talk about this, which is why I find interesting there has been a number of policies and strategies that have been developed in the past few years that not always entirely match sort of the actions that then we've seen.
The big dilemma for Europe and the UK is both have very strong ties historically, culturally, linguistically, in the case of the UK, to the United States. People don't like the term, but civilizationally, it's part of the West. Things like the Enlightenment. So the relationship with the United States is strong, and we want it to be strong. And I'm not saying this just as an American that's lived his entire adult life in Europe. But it is important to recognize that we still are, in many cases, cut from the same cloth, even notwithstanding differences. But, the French and the Germans are very, very, very different from the Dutch and the Italians, right? So it's still, I would say, cut from the same cloth in many ways. And so maintaining strong ties with the United States, and there's also a security reason to do that, is important. But there's still that big, strong dependency on China. Also in terms of, it's a big market for European manufacturers. And increasingly, the interesting thing is China has a lot of technology that can be used in Europe, right? And we think about the green transition. The Europeans aren't leading on it. They tried up in Sweden, didn't work. But so there's a lot that, and the Americans can benefit as well from Chinese technological advances in the green space. So in the case of Europe and the UK, what can be done, or what is being done to kind of keep the door open to China while not upsetting the Americans? Which I would say is also a debate that's somewhat still happening in America, right? There's still a lot of interests that still want to trade with China and don't want to have this escalation. So it's not just America's all on the same page on this, but it's less. It can go after China in a bigger way than the Europeans can. And so what is being done?
So this is the sort of the question.
Yeah, $1 million question.
If I had an answer, probably I would have a highly paid in advising European governments on how to balance the relationship. But jokes aside, let me say one thing. I'm going to tell you what has been done and what is happening. But I think it is important to say up front, things are getting more difficult. In the sense of a lot of the policies that are coming out from DC are becoming a lot more granular. And they've always had a very strong extraterritorial component, and they have it. And so it becomes increasingly difficult for Europeans, and I put the UK in the framework of Europeans, to be able to caveat some space of collaboration with China. And I don't know who said this. I think it was actually in a podcast that I recorded. Somebody said, it was Deborah Elms. She said how the small yard, high fences kind of paradigm is going to shift, is going to let us know basically how difficult it will be to balance that relationship. Because currently what we're seeing is an increasing granularity in what countries can and cannot do with China. And that creates challenges because there are ongoing collaborations. So how, for example, the policy on connected vehicles that will come out on DC may change how Europeans collaborate in the automotive sector with China in terms of what type of components can they build together? Is the solution of having joint ventures in Europe with Chinese companies to build batteries or other components? Is it a solution, or is it no longer viable because then those will be considered Chinese components, or at least components with a Chinese element, right? So everything is changing very quickly. And a lot of the solutions that we would have recommended a few months ago to the Europeans in order to be able to collaborate with China while at the same time have positive spillovers for Europe and for Europe competitiveness and make sure that there is alignment with the US may no longer be solutions. So things are moving very quickly. And I think that would be my first comment is, go ahead.
So I just wanted to kind of to summarize what you said so listeners can really understand. So basically at the European level, and this is happening also at national level, and even in the UK, that the rules of engagement are becoming more complicated because of, when you say granularity, I think if we could put it in context, it's a specific policy or regulation that prevents use of a particular Chinese product, which then leads into constraints on other parts of production, right? So if we think of so for example, here in Scotland, we have a lot of wind and they want to develop wind power. The Chinese are excelling on that. And you sort of think, like, isn't a wind turbine, I mean, come on, like, yeah, these are very advanced pieces of technology now, but it's still Don Quixote and it's windmills that have been around. But you think something as simple as a windmill, and you're like, no, there's a very specific component that goes in there, which, it's always the one where the Chinese can turn it off from Beijing. Half the time I think I wonder how true that is. But even on the other day, I was reading a former UK official saying that we can't have Chinese EVs or batteries because they're able to control the batteries. And so you think that even these all these products, right? And again, it's not just simply, oh, we regulate one product, but then that those products are, those little components are in everything else. And so that prevents a German automotive manufacturer buying components from China or a set of components in part of a product, and then it just really closes off the market. But I'm wondering, I guess the follow-up to that is that the intent from the regulators or the policymakers? I mean, is that just the outcome that we think we're solving a particular security threat here, but then actually what we want to do is protect our own industry? And that's, I think, one of the bigger questions that I always have is like, yes, there's a national security element, but how much of that is being used simply to protect domestic suppliers and companies from Chinese competition?
Look, that is the type of question that only somebody who's worked in the US administration to these type of policies is able to answer. Yeah. But what I can tell you is that, so the idea of going and regulate these little components in theory is positive, because instead of regulating a macro technology, so saying, I'm going to regulate the whole of artificial intelligence, right? You make very explicit what it is in the everything that composes artificial intelligence, and I'm on purpose taking the most flexible and broad of the technologies that you are concerned about and that you want to control. The issue is not, at least the issue that I have, is not even the fact that they are able to locate what it is. And it's not even that at the end of the day, probably because of how supply chains work, if you cannot do with that component, that creates ripple effects on other components and on sort of the final product. My issue, if I have one, is that while the United States has largely the capacity to implement these kind of policies, most European states do not. So most European states struggled even to have capacity to implement the simple FDI screening. Well, simple is unfair, but inbound FDI screening that we have been adopting in the past few years. A lot of EU member states lament they don't have enough staff, they don't have enough knowledge. And in a period where economic growth is not doing great, it's difficult to ask governments to put budget into growing capacity for these things, right? Especially if the decision doesn't come from their own government, but come from, the influence or the impact of external policies. So my objection, if I have one, is not even an objection. My comment is, I don't have a problem with the fact that they were able to identify which technologies are of concern and that they were able to find solutions on how to mitigate that concern. My concern is that Europeans will not be able to implement those policies, not because they don't want to in principle, and maybe that's the case, but because they simply don't have the capacity to do so.
You mentioned low economic growth in that statement. And I think that is one of the biggest, that's Europe's biggest challenge, and UK in particular. I mean, you look at productivity and you compare it with productivity in China, you compare it with productivity in the United States, and Europe doesn't have the luxury, and again, I include the UK, it doesn't have the luxury to close itself off to anybody. It's a rule taker and it's a market taker now. I mean, there's not much they can do. So I think that's what makes this US-China rivalry really difficult, is because in a way Europe needs both the US and China to sustain its growth and innovation. How do you see that playing out in this? I mean, is that going to be a constraint? I mean, you mentioned this, so governments just don't have the capacity to play this game.
Yeah.
And that probably means that companies don't have, or they won't act because they're afraid that, well, are we going to be regulated? Are we not going to be regulated? Maybe it's easier for us to just not trade in this particular technology, or we'll set up in the United States, or we'll, trade in another location. How does the productivity problem shape that rivalry, at least the reaction to it?
To begin with, I mean, we already mentioned that relocation is a major concern, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that concern is going to go away. As far as China is concerned, you have companies adopting this idea that they are in China for China. They're developing their business in China for the Chinese market. And to a certain extent, depending on the company, that development is separated from the business development in the rest of the world, right? So you already see that companies are not abandoning the Chinese market. They're just coming up with solutions in order to stay in the Chinese market and at the same time developing still business elsewhere. And that is sort of the point number one. There's a difference in how the UK and the EU are navigating this situation, I have to say, in the sense of what we've seen so far, and it may change in 2025 as we go forward. But the EU is largely sticking to that idea of battling or fighting unfair practices, which means that you still see a lot of attempts at leveling the playing field with China. I think today was the first international procurement, the first investigation under the international procurement instrument launched by the European Union against China. So you still see a lot of that happening from the European Union. Now, there's also a dynamic that the European Union has that the UK cannot have, which is the EU can do one thing and then member states can do another one, right? The EU can be very, can care about unfair practices, trying to level the playing field, and member states can go and try to advocate for a closer business relationship without taking away that narrative from Brussels. This is something the UK can no longer do, as you said, since 2016. Okay. And so what you see, especially with the current government that has so much attention on growth, and rightfully so, is that you see a much more prominent engagement agenda. Reeves was in Beijing, and she boasted a lot that engagement agenda. She went there with business support. So there's a bit of a difference there in the sense of the EU is engaging, don't get me wrong. But if you look at the engagement from Brussels of the past few years and months, you do see a lot of attention around leveling the playing field, unfair practices, starting with the tariffs on EVs, right? The EU adopted tariffs on EVs, the UK didn't. Now, the reasons are multiple and we can talk about and maybe even right. But there's a difference in the way to navigate the situation. And the EU hasn't got to that, and maybe it will never go back to that engagement perspective that it did before. There's also a difference in the way they approach the United States, right? There's this idea, which I don't know how actually embedded in the government and ministries are, but there is this idea circulating of the UK can hedge its position because it has the freedom to do so, because it's no longer part of the European Union. And I'm giving away what I think about this position by the tone that I had in the last sentence. I mean, I've seen how smaller countries have tried to hedge, and then at the end of the day, hedging doesn't work. And I don't think hedging is a strategy in the case of the UK. The EU, on the other hand, because it's the 27, is positioning itself to negotiate. So it may work, it may not work, but at least they have an idea of this is what we can offer. Now we can debate whether, that is feasible or not. These are our priorities. This is where we want to get. Now, again, I don't know if the edging is part of the actual strategy or just rumors around London of how the UK should position itself. But in my opinion, edging in this case is not a strategy.
Yeah, I when you said that, I was thinking the question I want to ask is, are you sure that the UK has a coherent China strategy? Right? Yeah, so Reeves went there and brought back not very much actually in commitments in terms of investment, £600 million, which that's like not very exciting. It's a small amount, but you're right. I mean, you said it, right? The UK is a small country in the grand scheme of things. As a member of the EU, it it can actually negotiate. And it can also push back on the Americans, right? This idea that if the Americans are going to, I mean, there's certain things that the Americans can force, but at the same time, there's things that Americans buy from Europe, and there's companies that source from Europe that are going to be pretty upset if they have, limited access to the European market or through some kind of sanction or a trade barrier. But in the case of the UK, there's less options, and it also then pushing back against China. I just don't see. I agree with you. There's the ability to hedge is very limited.
Yes. And look, we haven't seen the China audit yet. The results have been, in my opinion, rightfully postponed to probably early spring. And the reason why I say rightfully is because my own professional bias, when you do these kind of audits, is important to do them well. So it's important not to rush the result of how the bilateral relationship is, where we can leverage it, where we need to rethink it, and etc. It's very important to do them well. So if you do an audit, might as well take an extra few months and do it properly.
Is this a UK government audit of
the relationship with China, of the bilateral relationship? Yeah, exactly, with China. So there's an ongoing audit, and we should see the results probably around March, early April. Okay. And so we don't really know in terms of what is the China-related direction of this government specifically, right? So we're still waiting to know whether they have a strategy. At the same time, if you compare it to the European Union, the EU in theory has a clearer strategy, but the official strategy is that of 2019 still. So it's still the strategic outlook that defines China as a partner, economic competitor, and systemic rival, yes, which basically means everything, right? Yeah. And I don't know. We've talked about this so many times in terms of, yes, it gives you flexibility to do everything you want to do. It gives flexibility to the 27 member states, because finding one strategy for 27 is really difficult. And then it has slowly shifted towards this idea of de-risking. Now we're going to have the competitiveness compass probably coming out on January 22nd. And how does economic security and competitiveness, how do they come together? What is the role of China? So in terms of actionable points of the strategy, again, the UK has fewer points that are visible than the EU. But probably this episode is just coming at the wrong time, because once the audit is out, hopefully, finger crossed, we'll have a clearer idea of what is that the UK wants out of the bilateral relationship with China.
With China. On Europe and European member states, how we see clearly a rightward shift in governments. We already have, in Italy, you have Giorgia Meloni. In Germany, the government collapsed recently in their elections, and AfD will likely do very well. CDU is probably, whether they'll be able to keep them out of government. I'm not a German politics expert, but it's going to be a very interesting scenario. We've seen this play out in Austria with the far right being asked to form a government. You already have Orban, who's been around in a few years' time, who's going to be the president of France. So you just have this really rightward shift in the populist direction. How will that affect? I mean, I still think the EU is going to stay together, but when you have 27 member states, many of whom have a different ideological bearing, and one that is also a bit more nationalist in the sense of realpolitik. There are countries and there are winners and losers, and we have to choose sides. And that's clear, right? I mean, if we think about the ethos of the liberal ethos of the European Union coming together, and this idea of global governance where we all come together and kumbaya and what have you, now it's going back to, nope, there are borders, there are national interests. And yeah, we're going to have to choose sides. It's China or America. It's Russia or not, right? And so how is that going to affect the U.S.-China rivalry in playing out in Europe?
So many things to say.
Yes.
So what I would like to say is this should be the moment where Europe needs to come together. This should be the moment where, we become stronger as a union of 27. By the way, I'm using we. I'm based in London, so I don't know the impact that will have on my life. But anyhow, the EU should come together. And I just want to bring, let me bring a silly example in a moment. But if you look at the Draghi report and the need to, spend 800 billion a year in innovation to do through common debt mostly. And then if you think about the debt break that the German government has, whether it will survive the new government or not, then how do you do that? And here comes a silly example. When you have a European Union where an Italian bank, UniCredit, cannot acquire a German bank because of concerns that are linked clearly to the fact that it's a German bank, that the other one is an Italian bank, then why are we even having conversations about capital union and banking union and common debt? Right? Yeah. So we're talking about very, very basic issues. And these have been there for a very long time. So clearly they're coming to surface in terms of sentiment and popular support. Now a lot stronger with the right-wing turn of Europe. But in general, they've been there for a very long time. I still remember conversations in Italy around French companies acquiring Italian companies, which were seen as problematic because, this is an Italian champion. How are we going to leave it to a French company? And this is still happening. So this is sort of point number one, is we should be coming together, and we're not coming apart, but we're not able to overcome those smaller, very, very small challenges. Point number two is, at least in the past, there was a sort of Paris-Berlin axis. You had Merkel and Macron, that they were able to work together, drive European foreign policy, give a sense of direction to European foreign policy so that the others could follow. Well, they could push back, but at the same time, they had an idea of where it was going. That doesn't exist anymore. Not only because Macron is weak now, of course, in Paris, as we've discussed, but also because for some reason the relationship with Scholz wasn't ideal. And now, of course, we have elections in Berlin in any case. And then we're going to have elections in Paris in 2027 again, right? So that sort of Berlin-Paris axis that was guarantee of EU foreign policy doesn't exist anymore. So who's driving EU foreign policy? In theory, although it shouldn't, up to last year, it was the Commission. Ursula von der Leyen still is, but definitely was a very strong Commission president. She had a strong mandate. Between the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, she was the leader that could take very also controversial decisions in terms of EU policy and in part foreign policy. She clearly imposed a change in EU's position towards China as well. Her China speech of 2023, European Commission president that gives a speech on China, quite a unique thing, an event. She's much weaker now. The current European Commission is much weaker. Her mandate is much weaker. The composition of the European Parliament is, again, more right-leaning, weaker in terms of appetite for reforms. They are looking into the reform of the framework for FDI screening, and there seems to be very little appetite for proper reforms of that. And I've heard people saying if we had the former parliament, this would be easier, but with this parliament, it's more complicated. And then, of course, you have the council, who's always been a bit of an issue, but currently is even more an issue. Right, so that is the second element. And I'm not sure that even the opportunities that some right-wing governments, like that of Giorgia Meloni, may present in terms of her relationship with the president of the United States it can present opportunity. I'm not sure Brussels has the ability to capture those opportunities. So everything you're seeing in terms of political setup is against a successful European Union in this scenario, which doesn't mean that it's not going to be able to succeed. It just means there are so many more challenges compared to 4 years ago.
Just a quick question on Giorgia Meloni, because I read recently she went out to visit Trump at Mar-a-Lago, but she's also very strong around Europe, and some have saying that, she's the one that's actually the leader of Europe now, or maybe that's an exaggeration, but she's kind of taken this position as that she's driving Europe in a particular direction. But as you're saying, that's not a viable strategy for Europe, or,
It's a difficult question.
Yeah.
And for me, it's particularly difficult because I'm Italian, so
yes.
Officially, yes. But let me try to give you a well-constructed answer rather than how Francesca feels this evening.
Yeah.
So I think there's an opportunity there, but I think there are some obstacles and issues with betting too much on Giorgia Meloni.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, this year is sort of her half term. So in a couple of years' time, in theory, we go to elections again. So that is the afterthought. Secondly, she's a lot more a national leader than a European one. Her political platform is based on her being proud Italian woman, rooted in traditional Italian kind of values. So I don't even know how much appetite she has to be a European leader in this conversation rather than an Italian one. And that is because there's a cost that comes with becoming too European, especially when your electorate is so much attached to their other picture of you that is very much Italian. And that is why I'm saying I'm not quite sure Brussels has tools currently to be able to captivate somebody like Giorgia Meloni into turning her very Italian agenda. And I'm sure that whatever exchange she had with Donald Trump was a lot about Italy. I mean, at the time we had an Italian journalist being captured in Iran as well. So, I'm sure it was largely about Italy. Also, Italy is not reaching the 2% defense spending. So I'm sure a lot of conversation would revolve around that. So how do you move from that to let's make this person try to advocate for some European interest? I don't know, again, but I'm not sure Brussels is there quite yet.
And you mentioned that 2% defense spending, and that's what I wanted to ask you, is in this cacophony of Europe, maybe cacophony is too harsh to say, but this lack of cohesion, unity, at a time that unity is required, how does the continent rearm when Donald Trump is not saying 2% even on NATO norm? He's saying 5%. I mean, I think that's a property developer that's trying to get you to, selling you a $2 million condo that's really worth $1 million, right? But he's still pushing, wants to see increased defense spending. And it's not that Europe can't find, Europe is still a grouping of mostly very rich countries. We should remember that. And choices can be made on where public funds go. But the bigger issue is it would be much easier to funnel that capital and to defend spending in a much more cohesive industrial base, one that doesn't have, all these competing national champions to build weapons, as it were. You don't need one tank. One tank is probably enough, or one weapon system instead of 27. But as you just mentioned, if an Italian bank, UniCredit, which just isn't some random bank. I mean, UniCredit is a very large financial institution.
Yes.
Can't buy a large German bank. And again, then how is it that we're going to get coordination on defense spending, which makes that increase, which is necessary to kind of channel that increased defense spending? What's going to happen?
I'm going to give you a better one. If the invasion of a neighboring country by a major neighbor country doesn't push Europeans to spend more in defense and to think about how to do that more smartly, then what will, right? I don't have an answer. I'm not a defense expert. I don't know much about, I know very little about defense procurement. And I've become acutely aware of that now that I'm around and I am surrounded by people who actually know
That's all they
loads
think about
these topics.
Yes.
Exactly. So I'm very self-conscious about not saying anything silly here, because then, next time I go to the office, they'll be telling me you were wrong on this. But at the same time, you're right. And look, I'm just going to bridge it here to make it easier for me. A bit of a similar conversation happens around industrial policy, right? So we all want to do industrial policy. We all want to have chips. We all want to have batteries. We all want to produce the same things. And there's very little conversation and coordination going around, okay, are we all investing in the same things? And is there a demand for these things? Or are we just creating ourselves overcapacity? And what I always say is, I don't have a problem if these are private enterprises. So if private companies with private money decide to create overcapacity because they want to, they don't care about wasting monies and not making revenues because there's no demand, and then they fail, entirely up to them. I won't be the one saying you shouldn't have done that, because it's free market. It's fine.
It's capitalism.
Exactly. So you do whatever you want. But if it is public money, so if what we're talking about is subsidies or forms of subsidies into a specific sector of the production, then when people tell me we cannot coordinate with other countries because that would be a planned economy, I'm saying, sure, there's a degree of planning there. But is it worse to coordinate and plan and share information among EU member states who in theory have a single market than creating redundancies within that single market with public money? My answer is no. And obviously we can debate how much I am being extreme here, and maybe this is a little bit too much in a free market system, but it's free money at a time where, it's public money at a time where budgets are very tight and taxes are going up. So what do we do with that public money is extremely important.
You just, the Hayekian classical liberals that are listening are like, yes, you just made the argument against industrial policy. But I think it's a you don't have to be that extreme, and you're not. I mean, in the sense of, yes, I mean, private companies spending and what they're investing in, fine. You want to invest in that and you go back. And that's the whole point. Let the market decide. But with public money, and again, this is where, we've seen in the last, industrial policy is a word that people use now and everyone kind of gets excited about it. There's a particular star academic that's going around the world telling countries they can be entrepreneurs and we need more of that. And you just think, wait a minute, let's stop for a minute, because on a certain level in the history of capitalism, there's always been some level of industrial policy happening in many places. Now, people argue and say that's not true, Adam. There's always been like pure market forms. But again, we see across advanced economies in particular some level of coordination, at least during certain periods of time. And it's not completely kind of anti-Adam Smith, who's behind me, to say that governments shouldn't spend on large-scale infrastructure and the like. That's in the wealth of nations. But, your point, and this is where I get really kind of uncomfortable at the moment, is because industrial policy has become legitimate again. It's a legitimate thing, and everyone's like, we have to have an industrial policy. And I've heard people here in Scotland say, oh, well, what we just need is a more coordinated and more effective industrial policy here in Scotland and in the UK. And you think, yeah, maybe on certain levels, but at what point do we say no, 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 no? Because Scotland's a very tiny economy. It can't put a man on the moon like the United States did, nor should it try. And this is, I think, probably the problem across Europe is that everyone's doing their own little industrial policy when actually if you're going to do it in a big kind of economy that's a single market, do it in a coordinated fashion. But then again, and this is where I think those that are skeptical of industrial policy will say, it's like, even if you did it at that higher macro level at the European level, it's like, well, how do you know that you're not over investing in particular areas? And also, and this was always a concern of Adam Smith, is like, well, whose interests are at play? And, it's the collusion of the merchants that comes and that's the problem. And I think, it makes you want to become a bit more of a libertarian once you start playing it out. And that's not to say that, I'm necessarily one, but it again, the bigger point that you made, and I think that's worth emphasizing, is budgets are tight.
Yeah.
If we look at the tax take in the UK, it's the highest it's ever been. And that, look across Europe, it's not like these are low tax countries that can afford to raise taxes even more. And we're going to throw it at an industry.
I think that the biggest misconception, and probably is linked to how people view China's success, is that industrial policy equals success.
Yeah.
And probably also people have the misconception that industrial policy is the solution and that it's going to bring growth and competitiveness and all of that. And they fail to appreciate a couple of things that happened in China, and probably is because we haven't been good enough at explaining it. But first of all, it takes years. It takes at times decades. And not just in China, but if you look at development of technologies such as the lithographic printing, I think it took 30 years from
for what ASML.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, people look at ASML now, which is the crown jewel of the Dutch kind of economy. I mean, this goes way back in the early 80s with Philips and what they were doing, and it started in the US. So it's like we need to think about investments in this framework of investments in terms of industrial policy, in this framework of we're investing today, but we may not see the results in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Mm-hmm. So that also needs to give a sense of how much you invest and where do you invest. And that is sort of point number one. Point number two is there's not enough appreciation of how much money China threw at different sectors and how very few were actually successful. People like to say, and they should say it more, for every BYD, which is a very successful Chinese EV maker, there are 10 or 20 other automakers in China that received the subsidies from the Chinese state that didn't make it. They didn't become as successful, right? So I think, again, this is important to appreciate. It takes, and China was doing this when it was growing at 2 digits, right? Mm-hmm. So China today perhaps is not even able to do what China used to do in the last 10 years. And then the third point, which has to do with what you said, who is this industrial policy for? Mm-hmm. And I think here there's a debate about what is the role of the state. And I don't want to get into these in the last 7 minutes. 5 minutes.
Exactly, of the podcast. Yeah. But it is a serious conversation. So if the state has a list of priorities for the state and for the economy, and that it means that, industrial policy is going to go in that direction, which means that the private actors that go in different directions, and they're not going to be helped by the state. Mm-hmm. That is fine, but it's a very clear statement of where you want your economy to go, because a lot more actors will be incentivized in covering those sectors because they will have incentives from the state, right? Which means that you are on purpose deciding that the other ones need to make it on their own, or they may leave your country to go somewhere else. So it's not an easy question of what is the role of the state and subsequently what is the role of industrial policy and subsidies. What we're seeing, however, it is a growth of adoption of industrial strategy. The UK is about to adopt an industrial strategy coupled with a trade strategy, which I think the two should always come together. So if other countries do the same, they should always do it in couple. But again, there's a bit of a difference between adopting a strategy and having an industrial policy, right? So strategy is a strategic direction. Policy is a little bit more actionable in terms of where exactly the money are going and how much is going where.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make, right? Because again, I think some classical liberals would argue with me, but again, there's, like you said, industrial strategy. I mean, states, but you can put strategy in, like, how do you, like, we want to have an educated workforce. So we have universities, we finance basic research. We don't pick what technology is going to be the best, but we fund broadly across, the technological spaces, or looking potentially at comparative advantage that we have in different sectors already. But again, it's without choosing, which is different than directing money. And I always think that's a better model because, again, it's about going back to this sort of level playing field, right? If you create the opportunity, but you also create the opportunity for experimentation among private actors, and many of them, assuming that some are going to fail, maybe many are going to fail, but some are going to succeed. And in that process of experimentation, more innovation happens. But then I think also, and this is probably something to finish on, or I do have one final quick question, but what you said about China, I think, is also needs to be emphasized, that yes, there's a lot of quote unquote state capitalism happening in China. There's a lot of top-down direction, but we underestimate the level of competition happening within China, right? So it's provincial governments that are also competing with other provincial governments. So it's who is paying for what. A lot of companies that are, startups, and like you said, in a way, it's like everyone received the subsidy, so that's kind of market-wide. But then there was competition that happened. And so when people say, when Northvolt collapsed, there are people say, oh, see, if we had more of a European kind of state capital support for Northvolt, Northvolt wouldn't have collapsed. And you think, well, wait a minute. Firstly, Northvolt received a ton of money from the Swedish government and from the European Union, right? So to say it didn't receive state capital and support is just wrong. And then how would providing it more capital actually solve the many technical problems that it had and then organizational problems? So it's, this idea that, some kind of industrial policy or a more coordination is going to fix things. It's like, well, probably not. And then even in the Chinese case, right, it's, when you look at the long term, I mean, China's just been focusing on development. I don't want to sound like a China apologist to a certain degree, but there has been a lot of just pure market capitalism at work. And I think that's what we have to recognize and I say we have to recognize that because the response to China often is, we just need to mimic the Chinese and throw more public money at industry.
Yeah, no, that's wrong. And if you allow me a comment before your final question is, I think there's also differentiation between industrial policy that is directed at starting a sector from scratch. And you need to be aware that has higher rates. Northvolt is a classic example. And on top of it, in the case of Northvolt, as in the case of many other startups / scale-up in general, is, again, taking into consideration that the people who start these companies are not managers. In most cases, these people are actually really intelligent and bright people that have a great idea. And then, in the case of Northvolt, you could make the argument that it just scaled up so quickly, too quickly, to keep up with what was happening from the organizational perspective. And that is different from doing industrial policy to boost areas of the economies where you're already strong. So, for example, in the case of the UK, thinking about trying to build a little bit more on the effort around AI, I think is sensible. Thinking about medtech, thinking about fintech, and these areas where objectively the UK is doing well. So why not trying to make it bigger in order to bring advantages to the economy? And it has higher chances to actually bringing advantages to the economy. Then yes, the clusters already exist, the employment pond can be grown. So in that case, I think there's a slightly different type of thinking. And the last point that I would like to make is the reason why I'm saying there needs to be more cooperation, sharing of information in Europe in general, is that overall, one of the successes of China is the creation of ecosystems, right? So you have areas, geographical areas, where a lot of the needed supplies and companies are concentrated. And that is why TSMC, for example, decided to open in Dresden and not somewhere else in Europe. Is that because in theory, you have an automotive cluster where the demand for those chips that will be produced will be there. And so that has the potential to be successful. So I just hope that, when people think about industrial policy and industrial strategy, they take these things into considerations, because it's not just the general industrial policy that is an issue. There are differentiations, and in certain cases they work, in certain others they have higher risks. And I'm sure there is a lot of literature out there that analyzes this that I'm not aware of, but it's definitely there.
I was going to ask you a final question, but I think that was a good point to end on. I want to thank you for not saying "so" all the time, though.
Thank you. I did say it a lot anyway.
Did you? Yeah. But what you need to do is you need to lean into being Italian and just be, just say "allora" and then go back into English.
Yeah,
I think that'd be awesome. Start doing that on your podcast, right? We've done it here on mine, so
signature.
Allora. Yes. Okay. So thank you so much, Francesca. I'll just say ciao because you're Italian. Why not? And hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Adam. Ciao.
Ciao. You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.